The puppies are joining us.
Oh,
Oh, there he is. All right. All right.
oh, how cute.
Oh
I-
my goodness.
I've noticed your wonderful canine, Danny, can last about, I don't know, how many minutes until he gets in and wants some
Well,
attention.
no. I put Shanti out in the garage temporarily. I've explained it to her because she thinks that when it gets to be 7:30, it's her time to go out for a walk.
I
Oh.
see.
She'll start barking and jumping up on me and saying, "Okay, it's time now." And at 90 pounds, she's a lot more than Eileen's little puppy.
Yeah. Thank you, Danny, for who you are and all you do. Take it away.
Great, you guys. The bottom line is that when we got together the last time, 2 Fridays ago on May 29th, it was just the third night of the major demonstrations that were breaking out, primarily in Minneapolis at that time. And at that time, people didn't have any real idea of the size and scope of what it is that was going to be happening here. But as the week unfolded, the first week after we rang off together last time, it unfolded to the point where there were actually 17,000 state National Guard troops were mobilized around the United States. There were 30 different states that had declared states of emergency, had declared curfews, prohibiting people from coming in. The National Guard had been mobilized. The police departments were going on 24-hour shifts. And we recall seeing, actually, as you recall, the 3rd precinct in Minneapolis being set on fire, and people actually dancing in the streets against the flames of the police department burning. And the reality is that there were a significant number of people around the country who were actually, whether they said it or not, were going, great, look at that. They're actually having the courage to burn the police department where these 4 police guys came from. And then I said to myself when I was watching, Sarah and I and Danny Paul and Dagan and Ben Eichert and I were watching that live, and I started to say, wait a second here. Wait a second. You can't give in to the temptation to be happy that a police department is being burnt down by the local citizens. And then I realized that Trump and the Republican Party and everyone were going to be focusing on just that element of what it is that was happening during this 2-week period since we were together. And we know that what's happened here is there has been the same blue versus red split that we've been talking about here. That Trump has been going so far as to insist that even the 75-year-old guy on the street who the police knocked to the ground and gave him a skull fracture, and he has a brain injury now from that he was some sort of a conspirator coming from the anti-fascist group in the country. And Trump started tweeting that the violence was being instigated by the far left, that the far left was into just trying to tear the country down. And then, of course, on the other hand, the MSNBC and CNN were broadcasting live all of the demonstrations everywhere, and bringing on people who consistently and regularly were in a certain sense almost dismissing the violence and saying that the real point to focus on is that 99% of all of the people are being peaceful, and that the police are attacking the innocent and peaceful demonstrators. And of course, this all sort of came to a head outside of Lafayette Park when Trump actually mobilized the United States military. And contrary to the Posse Comitatus Act, ordered the United States military into Washington, D.C. to disperse a completely peaceful crowd because William Barr had decided that he was going to, quote, expand the security perimeter around the White House. And that therefore, without telling anybody that they were inside a newly expanded security perimeter, the militarized police backed by the United States military with the Joint Chiefs of Staff in full battle fatigues, camouflage, marching beside the president and the attorney general, and basically almost his entire cabinet marched out into Lafayette Park so that Trump could hold a Bible up, upside down, as it turned out, in front of the church across from Lafayette Park. Now, this was sort of the high water mark or low water mark of the entire 2-week period since we've been together. But very fortunately, it's resulted in the general officer that is the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff actually publicly apologizing. General Miller came on national television, or actually to the academy, the military academy, videoed an apology saying that he should never have been there, but not because it gave the impression that the United States military was being deployed against the citizenry of the United States, but because he simply didn't want to be viewed as political, and that he viewed the stunt that Trump was involved in undertaking at the time to be a political stunt to try to mobilize his growingly smaller and smaller constituency to mobilize for his election. Now, so the situation that we have now, I want to direct your attention to an article that was written just a few days ago. It was written on June 8th. It's now the 12th. So just 4 days ago, it was in New Yorker magazine. And I guess most of us don't subscribe to New Yorker magazine. So I wanted to call your attention to it. There was a woman by the name of Keonga Taylor wrote a major article in the New Yorker actually questioning whether or not the United States had the capacity to make the kind of changes that were necessary to respond to what it is that's going on now. And she went to great lengths to point out, which is a very important point, that it isn't a matter. In a lot of the news media, MSNBC, CBS, and even CNN and New York Times are all taking the position that they've shifted over now to saying that these kind of incidents, like the May 25th killing of George Floyd, cannot any longer be perceived as just a few bad apples on the police department sort of individually getting out of control and acting irresponsibly. That this has to be viewed as a symptom of systematic racism inside the police departments around the United States. What she's pointing out is that also is too limited an understanding of what it is going on. And she cites at some length Martin Luther King in a number of his speeches, in which he was pointing out way back in the 1960s, in the mid-1960s actually, that these acts of police violence on the part of white police officers against young black men unarmed and killing them, using such violence as to kill them, is in fact a demonstration not only of systemic racism within the police departments, it's a manifestation of the deeper, still very manifest racial bigotry and prejudice inside the American people and the institutions. Now, she goes on to make that point clear in her article and she is saying, very importantly, and I want you to take a look at that article. You can pull it right up on the internet for free. Just go to the New Yorker magazine of June 8th of 2020, and it's Keonga Taylor, Keeanga, Keonga Taylor, that'll pull that article up. She goes on to point out that in order to remedy the problems inside these police departments, it's going to require a massive overhaul of these police departments. She doesn't get into the debate about what defunding the police means or any of those things that have been going on. Well, what she says is that it's going to require massive amounts of money to retrain these police departments. And she says that it's going to have to come at the expense of what she refers to as the plutocrats and the plunderers of our economy. in the banks and in the financial institutions and in the major corporations that are basically establishing a country that is rooted in inequality, that is based upon the motivations of corporations to saturate people with materialism, and so that the racial inequality between the members of the African American community and the white community are exacerbated by the dramatic economic disparity between the two of them. And so that she goes on to point out that the curing of this long time, 400-year racial prejudice inside the United States has to be addressed. Now, that is all just the setting for what I want to talk about, because actually, just a couple days later, her article was on June 8th. The next day, actually, on Tuesday, June 9th, Cornel West, the ubiquitous Cornel West, we all know so well, appeared on Brian Williams on his 11th hour on MSNBC, and he made a different point, and I think it's a more profound point and more radical. And that is, he said that the reason that you're not going to be easily able to solve the problem of the lack of accountability of the police officers who engage in this fatal violence against young black men, and in a number of instances, young black women, is because that lack of accountability is just a subfunction of the fundamental lack of accountability on the part of all of the governing class. That all of the major people that are in political office have a free pass, basically, to get away with what they're doing. That the people in Congress, we know, uniformly take advantage of the inside information they know to engage in investments and stuff that they have a direct interest on. They sit on the committees. They get campaign contributions from the corporations that financially benefit from the votes they cast on the individual committees. The corporate executives get off scot-free. The bankers, we all know of the classic example where a banker in a large city is caught embezzling money from his bank, and he doesn't get prosecuted at all. He's punished by the embarrassment of then having to retire early and get his golden parachute and go off into the quiet retirement. But the idea that they would even think of prosecuting him and putting him in prison with all of these minority people is just beyond the pale. And the fact of the matter is that manifests itself in even larger terms in dealing with the entire 2008 debacle of the credit default swap scandal going on in all the financial institutions and banks. Not a single one of those people went to prison. Massive billions and billions of dollars that they generated through the fraudulent generating of mortgages on property, and having people redouble their mortgages and take out mortgages on their property that they knew they couldn't cover. And yet not a single one of those people went to jail over that. We see it exacerbated in starker terms with Trump when he actually orders the Justice Department to reduce the sentence of Michael Flynn, which even the Justice Department people recommended, and he got William Barr to intervene and change the recommendation for the sentence, and then turning around and releasing Paul Manafort from prison, after just a couple months of a 7.5-year sentence, allowing him to go back to his rich mansion in New York City and spend the rest of his sentence there on the alleged grounds that it was to protect him against coronavirus. And there wasn't a single case of coronavirus in the Pennsylvania prison where he was. And then when the media started ragging on him to say, well, wait a second, how come Trump ordered him to be let out, or the Justice Department did under Barr, and yet they didn't do it for Michael Cohen, because Michael Cohen had testified against Trump. And then lo and behold, within a matter of days, because they're embarrassed at that comparison, he's released from prison, on the grounds of a threat to coronavirus. Again, not a single other person in the facility where he was had coronavirus, but they released him. It's a one day story, and it just goes by the board. But the fact of the matter is, the major media are trying to portray that as some sort of a unique quality of the Trump administration, whereas in fact that's been going on historically. I mean, look at to just name a few of them. We all know personally that in the Iran-Contra case, George H.W. Bush pardoned virtually every single one of the people that we spent years prosecuting. We spent years digging up all the court admissible evidence against them. We forced the appointment of a special prosecutor. He indicted 16 of them, and in fact, Bush comes along and just pardons all of them. And it turns out to have been the same kind of thing that happened basically in Watergate. John Mitchell, the Attorney General of the United States, H.R. Haldeman, the Chief of Staff, John Ehrlichman, the Special Counsel, they all end up getting a matter of a couple months in jail, and then they all get released and go out and write books and go on the speaking tour of Republican conferences. And this type of lack of accountability on the part of the government individual officials takes on even worse dimensions when you understand that the Central Intelligence Agency of the United States government systematically engages in major campaigns of political assassination throughout the world, and smuggling massive amounts of heroin and cocaine into the United States with full not only knowledge but anticipation that it's going to be sold on the streets of our country, so that they can secretly fund their covert operations. Not that the Congress doesn't know about them, it's just that the Congress doesn't have to take responsibility for funding them because they're going to get in trouble. So they allow them to sell narcotics internationally, form partnerships with the mafia and major opium warlords like Bang Pao in Laos, in order to secretly fund massive assassination programs like the Phoenix program, for example. Now, in the reality that I want to get in front of us now, I don't want everybody jumping out of your first story window here, getting depressed about the reality that I'm sort of putting up in front of us here. The point is that subfunctions of this type of lack of accountability on the part of the elite governing class in our country and the elite financial class and corporate class is basically just a continued manifestation of the fact that they have designed an entire business vehicle, the private shareholder-owned corporation, by means of which the owners of the entire assets of that company, who make all the profits and get all the benefits from it, are completely immunized against any personal liability whatsoever for anything that the corporation does. And this is a business vehicle that I've touched upon before, that in basically 1872 to 1875, following the American Civil War, the basic robber baron class of urban industrialists and financial institutions basically created this business vehicle by means of which to completely exonerate all of the owners of capital in the country from any personal liability, and to allow a business device of the private corporation to engage unchallenged on simply pursuing the maximization of the profit of that particular corporation at the expense of every human level of decency. And if they end up getting caught, performing criminal activity, the corporation is held liable, and all they do is pay a fine. And the fine is absolutely 100% of the time, probably less than 10% of what the money is they made by performing the crime. And this is all going on directly in front of us, okay? And so for people to think that somehow the law enforcement officers who are on the street, fully armed, body armor, driving around in military vehicles now, basically patrolling the streets of the urban centers, are going to be held accountable for them basically inflicting the same kind of physical violence on the racial minority people in the central cities that they have been trained to inflict upon other minority groups in other parts of the world. That they've been deployed to the Middle East against the tribal people in the Middle East to seize their oil fields for the 7 major oil corporations. They've been deployed into Central America to overthrow democratically elected governments so that the major corporations can get access to their resources. Now, this is not some sort of Marxist rant here that I'm engaged in. What I'm saying as a constitutional scholar and as a civilian law enforcement officer who's been at this for 50 years, I have seen this over and over and over again. And I've had dramatic examples of the kind of lack of accountability of police officers, and I've never made the mistake of thinking that this is just a restricted minor problem of individual police officers. When the very first case that I ever did after I got into the bar was a case of a young fellow by the name of Ruiz, a Puerto Rican young fellow who was out in the Bronx, or actually out in Coney Island. He was on the way home on a Friday night, just after dark, from his father's house to go to his mother's house. They were separated, and there were police officers there that had responded to a call, and he came walking up to them, the little yellow tape that was up, and asked one of the officers what was happening there. And this great big 6'4" police officer who had just come back from the Middle East as a military guy leaped on top of him and broke his jaw and broke his eye socket, and beat him, broke his ribs. And his police partners had to pull him off this young kid and restrain him. And then they all joined together, all of them, in filing a charge against him for obstructing a police officer in the course of the performance of his administrative duties. I was asked by ACLU to represent this young fellow, and much to his good fortune, I happened to be in the Cahill Gordon law firm, and my law partner, who was in the immediate next office, I was just an associate, he was a partner, Michael Armstrong. Mike Armstrong, in addition to being the junior partner at the firm who recruited me, who came up to Harvard Law School to recruit me to come to the firm, he was also the general counsel for the Knapp Commission, which was the commission that was investigating potential police corruption in New York City. That's the commission where Frank Serpico, played by Al Pacino in that movie Serpico, was testifying to. And so he was next door. So I went over next door and told him what had happened. And I told him I wanted to call the local precinct where this police officer and his partners came from and get at the internal affairs investigative file. And so he gave me permission to do that. So I called them up and said, hello, this is Attorney Dan Sheehan. I'm calling from Mike Armstrong's office here in New York. And I want to be able to get a look at the internal affairs recordings of the interviews with the police officers on the scene of this attack against this young fellow, Ruiz. And so I went there to the headquarters and brought my briefcase with me, and they were unhappy and say, you can't take any notes, and so I went into the room, and I had brought a tape recorder with me, and it was inside my briefcase. So I opened up my briefcase and turned on the tape recorder and just played the recording of the interview of his partner, who told exactly what had happened and how he, without any provocation, jumped on this kid and was beating him savagely and had to be pulled off, etc. So I demand an immediate trial of this kid. I waive the preliminary hearing. I waive any kind of jury indictment. I demand an immediate trial. And I go to the courthouse, and I'm there with the clerk of courts, actually the magistrate judge, who wanted to have a preliminary hearing. I said, no, I'm waiving it. I want to go to trial right now. And he called me up to the bench, and he said, Mr. Sheehan, I know that you're just a young lawyer here, but I want to tell you, the DA has made an offer to dismiss all the charges against your client if he'll dismiss the civilian complaint that he has filed against this police officer. And I'm advising you to go ahead and do that, to dismiss that complaint, and we can get rid of these charges. And I said, absolutely not. I pulled out the photographs. I said, take a look at the photographs here. You know, he's got like 8 stitches in his head. He's got a broken jaw, broken eye socket. And the judge looked at it. He said, look, I'm just telling you how it is. He said, you know, if you don't dismiss these charges against him, they're just going to come after you, and they're going to try to everything they do to convict this guy. And so I said, I want to go to trial. So he set the trial. We go to the trial, and I'm in the courtroom, right? Judge John Fury is the judge sitting on the case. The entire courtroom is filled with police officers in uniform with their guns, right? And they're sitting in the courtroom, and they call the guy to the stand, and he gets up and lies completely, you know, in the same way that he'd filled out this phony report on what had happened. And so I take out the tape recorder and I put it up on the edge of the witness stand, and I say, you know, officer, I'm going to play a recording for you here, and if there comes a point in time when this refreshes your recollection as to what really happened here, you just stop me. And I turned on the tape recorder. I pulled the microphone down next to the tape recorder and started filling the courtroom with this report of his partner telling exactly what it is that had happened. And so we get about 3 minutes into this, and it finally dawns on Judge Fury what's happening. And Judge Fury starts pounding his gavel, banging his gavel, saying, shut that off, shut that recording off right now. And he said, what in the world are you doing, Mr. Sheehan? He said, you are attempting to impugn the integrity of a law enforcement officer of the city of New York. I said, yes, and I thought I was doing a pretty damn good job of it too. And the jury all started laughing, and he said, get this jury out of here. I'm going to deal with this now. And they take the jury out, and he said, listen, Mr. Sheehan, is it? He said, look, I know what you're doing here. You're just trying to get this guy off. And I said, Your Honor, I want to make it clear, you know, I've been asked by the American Civil Liberties Union to take this case. I'm taking it completely for free. And he said, look, I've been a trial judge for 40 years. Don't you try to intimidate me by telling me where you come from. He said, and I said, well, Your Honor, let's be clear. If you've been a trial judge for 40 years and you don't know any more about the law than you appear to, you certainly don't intimidate me. And so he was just kind of stunned. And he said, okay, Sheehan, he said, we're going to deal with this after this case is over. And I said, you know, now after it's over, I said, look, it's pretty well over anyway. I said, you've seen the jury. And so they came back and acquitted him, of course, immediately. And then I go up to the stenographer, the court reporter, and I say, I want an expedited copy of the manuscript of this particular trial right now. And I want it as soon as possible, and I want you to deliver a copy of that to the local district attorney. I'm going to go upstairs and see him right now. And the judge was still sitting there on the bench. He said, what are you going to do with that? And I said, I'm going to bring it to the district attorney. I'm going to demand a prosecution of this guy for perjury. And the judge said, well, I'm not going to have any part of that, he said. So I got up and went upstairs to the district attorney's office. I walked into the district attorney's office, and I walked in, and the secretary said, you can't go in there. You can't go in there. I said, yeah, I absolutely can go in there. And I opened up the door of the DA's office, and I walk in, and I tell him exactly what's happened. And I demand that this guy be prosecuted for perjury. And he looks at me, and he points like this up over his shoulder. And up on the wall, the district attorney's office, on the wall, there's this great big 4-foot wide, complete circular sign on the wall in bright blue with yellow trim, saying in yellow letters saying, cops are tops. And he says, look, he said, I've got to work with these guys every day. I can't do anything like that. Okay, so I know what we're talking about here, about the absolute, you know, lack of accountability for individual police officers. But I've also spent 50 years, you know, investigating the Central Intelligence Agency. I know in graphic detail, you know, about them having a full-scale CIA officer, you know, Paul Helliwell, assigned in Havana, Cuba, working as a partner with Santo Trafficante, the mob boss in Tampa, or in Havana at that time, along with Batista, the right-wing fascist dictator of Cuba at the time, in partnership smuggling heroin into the United States from the Golden Triangle. I know all the details about it. I sat and handed a memo across the table to the head of the DEA strike force in Washington, D.C., with complete details of the passageway in which they were smuggling cocaine from the Colombia cartel, with CIA cover into a particular home in Florida. I had the address, I had the telephone number, unlisted telephone number. I had the code words that you use to call that number to set up a buy. I knew who the woman was. It was Gambino's daughter, the mob boss's daughter that was running the whole thing. I pushed the memo across the desk to him, and he looked down at it and read it, and he pushed it back across the desk to me, and he said, "Look, Dan, you know what this is, and so do I. I plan to live to see my retirement." That's the head of the DEA strike force in the United States government. Okay, so what I'm saying is for people to think that that they're going to be able to hold accountable individual police officers for for pounding on black people and intimidating black people, shooting black people, killing black people in broad daylight, and that somehow we're going to be able to enforce the law against them or establish some sort of regime that's going to hold them accountable is completely untrue. It's completely untrue because, as I've said, this is simply a sub-function of an entire system that has an aristocratic governing class in the country. And they're directly aligned with the major corporations, with the major financial institutions, et cetera. And we know all about this. Now, the point is that the reason I'm saying this isn't because you haven't heard me say things like this before. What I'm trying to say is you cannot solve a problem without accurately identifying what the problem is. Now, that doesn't mean that every problem that you can identify you can solve, but you can't solve any problem by misidentifying it, by somehow conflating it with its symptoms and thinking that if you just address a symptom that you're somehow going to stop the problem. You're not. So what we have to realize is that focusing on the police department, you are not going to be able to get the present people who occupy the police offices to stop doing what they're doing. Because they're people who are the local town bully from the high school that's been recruited. They're the people that run the football team, the most aggressive linebackers from the local high school football team. They are the people who've just come back from the United States military, where they've gone through boot camp, being trained to kill people with bayonets and piano wire garrettes. You can't recruit those kind of people and then elevate them through the system and not have a system that is going to wreak violence on the people that they view as the people whom they're occupying. What you need is completely different police. You've got to recruit brand new police, not into that same system. You have to strip that system down and put in new police that are adequately educated, adequately trained, adequately motivated, and there are all kinds of elements of community policing, et cetera. Back in 1967, the Kerner Commission, after all the major riots in the mid 60s, laid out some 42 different proposals. They're the same exact kind of things that Joe Biden is now talking about, mouthing these platitudes about the things that need to be done, more community policing, more community trained. That's not going to happen with these people. They're the wrong people to have in those kind of positions. Those people believe that they're being recruited as combat officers to occupy a criminal war zone. So it's not coincidental that the Homeland Security Chief refers to the area as a battle zone. That's how they view it. That's exactly how the Tiger Swan Private Military Corporation out at Standing Rock, they in their internal memos, they were referring to that whole area where the peaceful Oceti-Sakowin camp of Native Americans was camped as the battle zone area. And that's how they view the whole thing. So what you have to do is you have to get rid of those people. You have to pay much higher salaries for police officers to recruit intelligent, well-educated, caring people into those positions. You have to de-emphasize the militarization of them, take away the military equipment from these people. There's a whole bunch of things that need to get done, but you need different people in there. Now, the same thing is true of the governing class. The fact of the matter is, we can cajole and attempt to threaten, intimidate, and threat to, run people against them, everything you want to do of the people that are presently in office. in 99% of all of the offices in the country. And all they respond to is threats and intimidation, threats to, throw them out of office or something. They do not ever do anything for the right reason. They're different kind of people. They're the kind of people that kept running for office all the time, right? They ran for the comptroller in the local political party. Then they ran for the head of the precinct, and they come up through the ranks, and they're not the kind of people that are there to try to perform public service for the most part. Now, people may be offended that I say that, but I say that only because I lived with them and I've seen them. And I've seen them all the way from when I lived up in Warren County and knew all the local political officials that were there. And I know them, from living in Washington, D.C. for 20 years. Every time you go in to talk to one of even the moderate or liberal members of Congress, they always say, go out there and make me do it. Go out there and organize everybody, get on the television channels, write letters to the editor, make me do this. Which means they have to justify themselves to the people who are funding them, And the fact is, you have to overwhelm. I've done this half a dozen times. I've done every single thing they've ever suggested we needed to do in order to get them to do the right thing. And then the final analysis, they give me the same conversation that the DA gave me back in the very first case I ever did. Hey, Dan, look, I got to work with these people who fund me, and I just can't do that, So you got to get them out of there. You got to get these people out of there. And you have to establish public financing for the elections. You have to run people for the elections. That's what we have to do. It isn't that we don't know what some of these things are. It's just that the people that are in office don't have any objective interest in doing those things. They have an interest in getting into office, staying in office, obtaining the perks of the office, and are funded by major corporations and financial institutions who actually come to them money in hand, demanding votes on particular bills in particular ways. Now, that's the reality that we're dealing with. But the fact is, it can be solved. But it's not in the same way to the old principle that you understand that Einstein says. You can never solve a particular problem from the same mindset that created the problem, and you can't get the people who caused the problem to solve the problem. Because they don't view it as a problem. They just view this as something they have to take care of. They have to figure out how to address this. And they've got the people that are advising Joe Biden right now. You got Larry Summers. The same guy that he's got people from Goldman Sachs that are all in there. He's got the same people that caused the credit default swap collapse of the financial institutions. They're all advising him on his economics, and he's got the DNC in there who were submarining Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren, from the day that they announced their candidacies, because they will not allow those people to come in because they're too big a threat to the corporations and the financial institutions that fund the Democratic National Committee and the Republican National Committee. So we all know this. So that in the context of this ongoing debate and discussion, just going on about what to do about the lack of accountability for individual police officers who kill young Black men, unarmed men, that is a subset of a much larger question that runs all the way on up to the very highest levels of the United States government, where you can't hold a president accountable. I mean, we have an absolute maniac in the office for 3.5 years now, and the whole structure and the system that's set up right now is completely incapable of getting him out of there. And he will announce, on open television that he could walk down Fifth Avenue and shoot somebody down and he'd get off. I mean, that's it. So that's not a system that is accountable. And it leads us back to the thing. I'll tell you something that you probably don't know, that you all remember hearing about the October surprise back in October of 1980 when Jimmy Carter got unseated by Ronald Reagan and George H.W. Bush. And you all know all the stories, the rumors going on around about the October surprise, about how Bill Casey and some say also George H.W. Bush flew over to Paris and had two meetings actually, one in Madrid and one in Paris, and met with representatives of Hezbollah and ended up getting them to agree to hold the 52 American hostages until after the November election in 1980, so that Jimmy Carter could look impotent and unable to free our hostages. You all know about that. What you don't know about is the fact that in that same election, under the whip hand of Theodore Shackley, who was the handpicked director of covert operations worldwide for the Central Intelligence Agency for George H.W. Bush, when he was the director of the CIA in 1975, 76, and into 77. That's the guy that coordinated the whole October surprise scenario, and at the same time brought millions and millions of dollars of drug money from the Golden Triangle, from the partnership that he had when he was the CIA station chief in Saigon with Vang Pao, the opium warlord in Laos. That money, a skim from those funds, was put into the Nugan Hand Bank in Australia. And Theodore Shackley, during the 1980 campaign, took millions of dollars out of that bank account in Australia from the Nugan Hand Bank and transferred it through two major banks in South Africa, the Afrikaner banks there, into the United States. And that is how they ousted Frank Church, who was the chairman of the Church Committee, the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence Abuse. Thank you, Patty. And ousted Dick Clark, the United States Senator from Iowa, who was opposing CIA covert operations in Africa, and also ousted Birch Bayh from Indiana, and tried to unseat Alan Cranston in California and George McGovern in South Dakota. But they got Jimmy Carter, they got Frank Church, they got Dick Clark, they got Birch Bayh. That's the United States Central Intelligence Agency Director of Covert Operations for George H.W. Bush. Unseated those people with hundreds of millions of dollars into the United States, into our campaign. And then these are the people who whine about Russia sending emails into our country during our election, and to suggest that that's tantamount to open warfare against us. And the hypocrisy of it is almost beyond words. And so what we have to do is we have to get rid of those people. Now, I am not an advocate of any kind of violence against those people. I believe that we can do this through the democratic processes. Still, I do believe that the other side is going to engage, the fascists are going to engage in every effort they can to restrict the people's voting rights. They're going to do everything in their power to stop mail-in ballots. They're going to do everything they can to take people off the voters list, especially minority groups that they think are going to vote for the Democrats. They're going to do all of those things. But the fact of the matter is, you have to be able to take them on, knowing who they are, knowing what they'll resort to, and still beat them. You can't approach them naively. You have to approach them like professionals. And the bottom line is, like I've told virtually all of you a number of times before in our lives together, these kind of politics cannot be a spectator sport. We cannot just sit back and wait to see who the Democratic Party pushes forward and then decide to vote for them because they're the lesser of two evils. And you can't spend your time going around just voting for a person in the Green Party who happens to be the local teacher in the Montessori school, who wouldn't know how to run a public transportation system if they became elected to office. I mean, this has got to be a serious undertaking to remove these people from office by growing an alternative set of candidates, training them, developing, very importantly, an entire panoply of public policies that are rooted in a systematic ethic. There is a social, democratic, egalitarian ethic. We have the advantage of the fact that this ethic has been espoused publicly over and over again since the very founding of our country. All of these ideals have been articulated. They're taught to children in the local schools. We have a right to bring these things into full fruition. This is the promise that our generation had made to us. This is the promise that we have made to each other, that we are going to see this brought to fruition in our time before we step out off on the stage. We have to get our second wind. We went at this thing from basically 1963 with the assassination of President Kennedy, all the way up until the high water mark that summer of 1968, in 72 and into 74, ousting Nixon from office, and bringing on the church committee hearings and doing all those things. We need to gird our loins. We need to step forward. We need to be aggressive in this activity. We cannot leave this stage and allow things to have degenerated to this point. And, at the risk of using a sports metaphor, you need to remember that every one of the great games in history has been won in the last 2 minutes of the fourth quarter. And the fact that we look like we're behind right now with a guy like Trump in office and with people rioting in the streets and getting tear gassed in Lafayette Park, and a president in office who's calling up the military to try to crush us, this is how it always looks. This is how it always looks at the end of the third quarter or the third act of a great motion picture or play. That's where we are right now. We're at the end of the third quarter. Things look grim for the heroes and heroines. But the fact is, this is where we have to take courage. We have to dig in. We have to understand what our ethics are, what our commitments are, and we have to work together to get this to happen. We represent interests of the American people, not the elite, not the governing elite, not the corporations, not the financial institutions, not the aristocracy that our constitutional order wanted to eliminate in our country. Okay, we represent the interests of the people, and we need to show that. I'm trying to bring you with us into kind of the new era, entering the fourth quarter. Right now, we're in a situation where politics are extremely fluid. Right now, in that there are three basic, I think, political consensuses right now that are operating. One is that Trump is a complete maniac. And we've got to get him out of there. And I think that the people are mobilizing now, and they're starting to peel off certain elements of his support with statements by the military commanders now withdrawing from him, saying they're not going to vote for him. They've got Powell saying that. We've got lots of people now starting. I think his base is starting to dissolve now into his actual base. So I think that the probabilities of him losing the election by more than the 5 million votes that are necessary in order to keep him from disputing it are building more and more right now. So there's that consensus that he's, even though we're some 5 months out from the election, that he's sort of on his way out, and he's going to continue to blunder the way that he is, of just playing to that base, that ever narrowing base that he's got. That's one consensus. The second consensus is that obviously Joe Biden is going to be the candidate for the Democratic Party unless something happens to him between now and then. So in the selection of his vice president is going to be extraordinarily important. I hope he's not going to be pandering to the moment. He's talking now about, there's some talk about him picking the black former woman chief of police of Orlando down in Florida to be his vice presidential candidate because it's so au courant, with everything that's going on right now. But I do not believe that she is really prepared at the present time to be the president of the United States. And I think that given people's concern about Joe and his state of health and et cetera, that their choice of the vice president is going to be extraordinarily important this time out. But assuming that nothing's going to happen to him between now and then, and he's going to go in for one term, there's an assumption that that's getting ready to happen right now. But the third consensus is that people are not at all comfortable about Joe Biden and the Democratic National Committee doing the kind of things that are necessary. to address any of these fundamental problems that exist in the country. They are classically the same old people offering the same old solutions. I mean, I mentioned Joe Biden is citing things out of the 1967 Kerner Commission report, you know, as to how you're going to respond to the police problem here. And he isolates it out, heaven forbid that there be a systematic analysis on the part of anybody, you know, in political office about what the repercussions are of a policy. You know, but he's not going to either come up with or get information from the DNC or from the Democratic caucus in either the House or the Senate to do anything very progressive. Because we saw the DNC systematically exclude and go after to get rid of Bernie and Elizabeth Warren as well. The only thing that could change this concern that everybody has as the third one of these areas of consensus about the concern about Joe Biden being president and not getting anything really effectively proposed would be if he were to select Elizabeth Warren, for example, to be his vice president. That would be the only thing that would encourage people in the progressive movement to have confidence in that administration. And so that everybody's going to have to look at what she's going to do. So I see from inside the Democratic Party politics that you and I have both seen from inside. We know what the challenges are right now for the party. And the fact is that the demographics are, that ship is sailing now. I mean, the whole, you get younger, more minority people, everything else, the Democratic Party has to become much more progressive than it is now. And it doesn't want to do that.